Linda, a confident flight attendant, unknowingly kicks out a billionaire with a vast fortune, all while unaware of his true identity. What begins as a moment of arrogance and pride quickly turns into an unforgettable lesson when Harry, a man of quiet strength, decides to get the ultimate revenge. What happens next will not only change Linda's life forever, but also challenge her perception of who holds power in a world often ruled by status. Before we dive deeper into this captivating story, don't forget to comment below where you're tuning in from and hit that subscribe button if you enjoy this tale. The early afternoon sun filtered through the shelter's modest kitchen, casting long shadows as Harry wiped the sweat from his brow. He stacked the last of the empty soup pots neatly by the sink, his movements steady and practiced. The familiar scent of dish soap and the remnants of stew clung to the air, a reminder of the hours he had just spent serving meals to those in need. For the past 6 hours, he had washed dishes, prepared food, and engaged in conversations with the shelter's guests, just as he did every Wednesday, without fail, when he was in town. "Thanks again for everything, Harry," called out Martha, the shelter coordinator, her graying hair pulled back into a messy bun. "You're truly a blessing to us." Harry offered her a warm smile, a quiet pride in his heart. "I love being here, Martha," he replied. His voice carried sincerity, and there was no place he'd rather be. As he grabbed his worn denim jacket from the hook by the door, he glanced at his watch. He had just enough time to catch his flight. The parking lot was quiet as he made his way to his modest Toyota Camry. For a fleeting moment, Harry pondered how different his life could have been had he chosen to indulge in the wealth that came with his tech empire. He could have lived in luxurious mansions, driven exotic cars, or taken lavish trips to exotic islands. Instead, he chose simplicity, a humble 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, and an unwavering commitment to serving others. Harry's thoughts drifted to his childhood, an upbringing marked by financial struggles and the lessons they imparted. It was these memories that kept him grounded, a reminder of why he refused to buy into the excess that surrounded him. As he drove to the airport, the warmth of the sun on his face and the comfortable fabric of his faded Beatles t-shirt against his skin felt like a small victory. Harry knew, deep down, that true happiness was not about the things one possessed, nor about seeking attention. It was about how one treated others and how one chose to spend their time. Today, just as he did every week, he had spent his afternoon making a difference in the lives of others, even if no one knew the true extent of his success. The bustling airport terminal was a familiar sight. He parked his car, grabbed his well-worn backpack, and made his way inside. His clothes were simple, comfortable jeans and sneakers, and no one took a second glance at him. He blended into the crowd, just another traveler making his way through the terminal. It was the way he preferred it. In a world where wealth was often flaunted and used as a status symbol, Harry found peace in being unknown, in being just another face in the crowd. As he approached the security checkpoint, Harry was hardly noticed. The TSA agent glanced at him dismissively before waving him through with a flick of her wrist. He couldn't help but notice how the businessman in front of him had been greeted with warmth and respect, while he had been met with indifference. At the check-in counter, the airline attendant barely acknowledged him as she typed away on her computer. It wasn't until Harry spoke up that she even bothered to look at him. "Destination?" she asked flatly. "Chicago, please," Harry replied politely. She sighed in response as though his very presence was an inconvenience. Her fingers clicked impatiently as she processed his ticket, hardly looking up from the screen. After what seemed like an eternity, she pushed his boarding pass across the counter without a word. He accepted the ticket, but as he turned to leave, he could hear her voice brighten as she greeted the next passenger with cheerful warmth. The contrast was stark, but Harry didn't let it affect him. His calm demeanor was unshaken. As he made his way through the terminal, Harry couldn't help but notice the subtle differences in the way he was treated compared to others. White passengers in business attire were met with smiles, respectful nods, and courteous gestures, but Harry, dressed in his simple attire, seemed invisible. Even when he arrived at the coffee cart, the vendor served 2 passengers who had arrived after him, before finally turning to take his order, clearly reluctant. Yet Harry remained unbothered. When he boarded the plane, he found his seat in the first-class cabin, The fresh scent of leather and pine cleaner filled his nostrils as he settled into his plush seat. The tall flight attendant standing at the entrance, Linda, surveyed him with cold, critical eyes. Her gaze was narrow, scrutinizing him as if he were a stranger who didn't belong. "Excuse me, sir," she said with a tone of authority that caught the attention of several nearby passengers. "This is the first-class cabin." Harry smiled gently. "Yes, I know." Linda didn't budge, stepping directly into his path, her manicured hand extended with a hint of impatience. "I'll need to see your boarding pass." Harry didn't flinch. Calmly, he reached into his pocket and handed over his boarding pass. Linda snatched it from his hand, inspecting it with an exaggerated air of suspicion, as if she didn't believe it could possibly be real. She turned it over, held it up to the light, and examined every detail, all while the other passengers fell silent, watching the spectacle unfold. "Is there a problem?" Harry asked, his voice soft but firm. Linda cleared her throat, still studying the ticket with obvious doubt. "I'm going to need you to verify how you obtained this ticket," she demanded. Harry, remaining composed, simply replied, "I purchased it through the airline's website, just like everyone else." Linda's eyebrows shot up. "These tickets cost thousands of dollars." She emphasized the word thousands as if to say it was inconceivable that someone like Harry could afford such luxury. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Harry kept his gaze steady. "I know how much they cost," Harry said calmly. "I fly first class regularly." Linda let out a dismissive laugh. "I've worked this route for 15 years, and I've never seen you before," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Maybe you're confused about which section you belong in." "I assure you I'm in the right seat," Harry replied firmly, his voice steady but carrying an edge of quiet authority. Linda stepped back and, without another word, pulled out her phone. "I'm calling security," she announced. "Something's not right here. We take safety very seriously." Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the cabin door. Linda pointed at Harry. "This passenger's story doesn't add up. I want him off the plane." The security officers exchanged looks before one of them spoke. "Ma'am, his ticket appears valid." Linda's response was sharp. "I don't care what it appears to be. As senior flight attendant, I have the authority to remove any passenger I deem suspicious, and I want him off this flight." The officers hesitated, but ultimately moved toward Harry. "Sir, we're going to need you to gather your belongings and come with us." Embarrassment swept over the cabin as passengers watched in tense silence. Harry stood with quiet dignity, retrieving his backpack from the overhead compartment. As he walked toward the exit, Linda stood there with a satisfied smirk, her uniform perfectly straight, as though she had just handled a serious threat. Outside the plane, Harry was met with apologies from the security officers, but he barely registered their words. His mind was already moving ahead, thinking of how to make this right. With a quiet sigh, he found a corner of the terminal and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered for a moment before dialing James. "I need you to gather the legal team," Harry said, his voice calm but firm. "Something's happened." He paused. "I've been removed from Flight 2317. We both know why." As he looked out the window at the plane he should have been on, Harry saw his reflection. A man in simple jeans and a faded t-shirt, no flash, no luxury. Yet, he stood there with quiet strength, knowing that his revenge would be far greater than any display of wealth. Meanwhile, aboard the plane, Linda moved through her pre-flight tasks with an air of self-assuredness, a small, self-satisfied smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She straightened the items in her service cart, paying extra attention to the champagne supply. Every movement she made, every item she adjusted, was performed with the belief that she'd just upheld the high standards of first class. "That's how you maintain control," she muttered under her breath, satisfied by the way she had handled the situation. The plane began its ascent, lifting off the runway and leaving Harry behind, unaware that the consequences of her actions would soon catch up with her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. 20 minutes into the flight, Linda hummed to herself as she maneuvered the drink cart down the aisle, still basking in the glow of what she saw as a job well done. The hum of the cabin was interrupted by a sudden crackle from the intercom. "Linda, Please come to the cockpit immediately. The captain's voice sounded unusually tense. Linda frowned, setting down the polished glass she'd been preparing, her mind already racing. Something didn't feel right. She made her way to the front of the plane, noticing her junior flight attendant giving her an odd, almost sympathetic look. The cockpit door opened and she stepped inside to find Captain Stevens, his face unusually drawn and serious. "Close the door behind you," he said, his voice tight. Linda's stomach dropped as she watched the captain's stern expression. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice betraying the rising tension in her chest. "We just received an urgent call from corporate," Captain Stevens said slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "The passenger you had removed from first class, that was Harry Rodriguez." Linda blinked, momentarily stunned. "I don't understand. Who is he?" "He owns 30% of this airline," Captain Stevens said, his voice carrying the weight of this revelation. "He's one of our largest investors and sits on the board of directors." The blood drained from Linda's face and her knees began to shake. She instinctively reached out to grip the back of the captain's seat to steady herself. "But he was wearing... he didn't look like..." "Corporate wants you to report directly to the main office as soon as we land," Captain Stevens interrupted, shaking his head. "They're saying this could be very serious." Linda's throat tightened as the full weight of the situation hit her. Her mind flashed to the image of Harry, his calm demeanor, his quiet dignity as she humiliated him, the polite way he had responded to her accusations, even when she doubted his valid first-class ticket. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What have I done?" Her perfectly ordered world, one built on assumptions and prejudices, began to crumble before her eyes. In an instant, she had allowed her judgment to be clouded, and now she was facing the reality of the consequences. Her body went numb as the realization set in. "You're to continue your duties for the remainder of the flight," Captain Stevens said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But report directly to the main office upon landing. They're expecting you." Linda nodded numbly, her hands trembling as she reached for the cockpit door. The short walk back to the cabin felt like an eternity. Her mind raced with the full implications of what she had done. Every step she took seemed to echo in her head, amplifying her guilt. As she resumed guiding passengers to their seats, each greeting felt forced. Her smile, once practiced and perfect, now seemed hollow, her every movement mechanical. She couldn't escape the image of Harry's dignified expression, the way he had silently walked away. How had she been so blind? How had she let her assumptions define her actions? Her phone buzzed again, another message from Human Resources, the fifth one in the past hour. She couldn't bring herself to read it. Instead, her mind replayed the harsh words of the station manager earlier. "This could end careers, Linda. This could end the airline." A young passenger asked for help with his bag, and Linda flinched, startled out of her spiraling thoughts. She helped him, but it felt like she was moving in slow motion. Her mind was elsewhere, on the mistake she had made. Her once carefully crafted sense of authority and control was slipping through her fingers like sand. "Linda," her junior flight attendant called gently, touching her arm. "The legal team needs to see you ASAP." Linda nodded, her throat too tight to speak. As she made her way toward the front of the plane, she could feel the eyes of the other crew members on her. Their gazes were a mix of pity and silent judgment. Her carefully constructed world of power, respect, and control had cracked wide open, and there was nothing she could do to repair it. As she walked through the terminal, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, each step felt like a countdown to the inevitable confrontation. The weight of her actions hung heavy in the air, and the few colleagues who passed by averted their eyes or whispered behind their hands. Linda straightened her navy uniform jacket, trying to maintain her composure. "It can't be that bad," she muttered under her breath, trying to reassure herself. "A write-up, maybe a suspension at worst." Yet the tremor in her hands betrayed her uncertainty. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the brief message from HR. "Report to the main office immediately. Meeting with senior management." Linda's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any reprimand. This wasn't a simple passenger complaint. The reality of the situation started to sink in. This could be the end of everything she had worked for. As she reached the main office, she hesitated for a moment, checking her reflection in the glass window. Her face was pale, her expression drawn with worry. She could hear raised voices inside, the distinct voice of the regional manager booming through the door. "This is a PR nightmare," someone said, their tone grim. Linda's carefully maintained composure cracked a little further as she imagined the worst-case scenarios unfolding in real time. What if Harry Rodriguez decided to sue? What if he went public with the story? In today's world, a scandal like this could go viral in minutes. The thought of it made her stomach turn. The door opened, and she stepped inside, trying to maintain a sense of authority. But when she saw Mr. Collins sitting behind his mahogany desk, his expression grave, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in. "Walk me through exactly what happened on Flight 2317, Mr. Collins said, his voice cold and professional. Linda straightened her back, trying to hold on to some shred of control. "I noticed a man in first class who didn't appear to belong there," she began, her voice more defensive than she intended. "He seemed out of place." She paused, moistening her lips. "I was simply following procedure when I asked to see his ticket." Mr. Collins didn't react. He simply waited for her to continue. "When he showed me his ticket, I had concerns about its authenticity," Linda continued. "In my experience, certain types of passengers sometimes try to upgrade themselves without proper authorization." She could hear the defensiveness creeping into her voice, but she pressed on. "I made a judgment call to protect the integrity of our first-class service." "What do you mean by certain types of passengers?" Mr. Collins interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I just mean people who don't meet our usual first-class profile. It's our job to maintain standards, isn't it? I've been doing this for 23 years. I know when something doesn't look right." Mr. Collins's gaze remained steady. "So, you had him removed from the plane?" he asked flatly. "Yes. For the comfort and security of our other passengers," Linda said, though her voice wavered slightly. Mr. Collins stood up, his fingers drumming against the desk. "Protocol requires you to verify a passenger's ticket, Linda, not make assumptions based on their appearance." He straightened his tie and looked down at her. "Please wait here while I discuss the situation with the executive team." Linda was left alone in the quiet office, the minutes stretching on as she stared at the airline awards on the walls, many of which she had helped the company earn. The ticking of the clock seemed deafening. Her certainty about her actions was rapidly crumbling piece by piece. Mr. Collins returned, the door closing behind him with a finality that made Linda's heart sink. He placed a manila folder on his desk before sitting down. "Linda, this is a serious situation," he began, his voice calm but firm. "The executive team has reviewed the incident, and effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending an internal investigation." The color drained from Linda's face, her throat going dry. "Suspended without pay?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. "This is ridiculous. I was doing my job. Your actions today expose this airline to significant liability," Mr. Collins continued, his tone unwavering. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind." "Discrimination?" Linda protested, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "That's not what happened at all. I was maintaining our standards." "Please turn in your airline ID and security badge before you leave," Mr. Collins said, sliding a formal notice across the desk. As Linda sat there, frozen in shock, the reality of her mistake came crashing down on her. What had started as a simple decision, a snap judgment, had now unraveled her entire career. Linda's fingers trembled uncontrollably as she picked up the letter. She could barely focus on the words printed in front of her, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest like an iron vice. "How am I supposed to pay my mortgage? I have bills due next week," she muttered under her breath, her voice tinged with panic. Her daughter Jessica's college tuition was due soon, and the looming financial burden threatened to suffocate her. Mr. Collins's voice was cold, distant, as he spoke again, breaking into her spiraling thoughts. "I understand this is difficult, Linda, but these are the consequences of your actions." The words cut through her like a knife. Linda stood up abruptly, her chair scraping sharply against the floor. She yanked her ID badge from around her neck and dropped it on the desk with shaking hands. Her eyes stung with the sting of unshed tears, but she blinked them away fiercely, not allowing herself to break down in front of him. 23 years of service, she said bitterly, her voice thick with resentment. And this is what I get? For trying to maintain standards? The bitterness in her words echoed through the empty office. As she walked through the hallways, she kept her head held high despite the trembling of her lower lip. Linda's life takes a dramatic turn after being suspended from her job as a flight attendant due to multiple complaints about discriminatory behavior. While dealing with the aftermath at home, she struggles with mounting financial pressures and a growing sense of guilt. She tries to hide the truth from her husband, Paul, but internally, she's confronted by the harsh reality of her actions. Meanwhile, the airline investigates Linda's behavior, discovering a pattern of complaints from passengers of color. The airline faces a major PR crisis, with the possibility of legal repercussions looming. Harry, one of the affected passengers, opts for systemic change rather than compensation, pushing for a diversity and sensitivity training program for the airline staff. His decision to focus on lasting change instead of personal gain inspires Linda as she begins a new life working at a diner. The job is humbling, but it offers Linda the opportunity to reflect on her past mistakes and grow. She starts to change her behavior, learning empathy and understanding, and gaining a new perspective on the world. Linda's journey becomes a process of personal redemption, where each small act of kindness helps her grow and move closer to the person she aims to be. Through her work at the diner, she sheds her old prejudices and finds peace, ready to face an uncertain future with hope and empathy.